So before we dive any further into our JavaScript journey, we need to understand something called a variable. Now, a variable technically means anything that is actually variable, something that can vary. Now, because JavaScript, as we learned, is a dynamically typed language, it can hold absolutely any value. So it is truly, in fact, a variable because it can be changed at any time. Now, to declare a variable, what we're going to do is use our index.html. Now, what we'll do is blow away our console log, and what we're going to do is create our first variable. Now, for this, JavaScript uses a reserved keyword called var. Now, we haven't looked at reserved keywords yet, but we'll come onto them momentarily because we need to know that we can't create variables under the same name as things that are, in fact, a reserved keyword. So, for example, I could create a variable called a, and that could be the entire statement. Now, statements in JavaScript, as we know, typically end with a semicolon as well. So that is a completely valid statement in itself. We have declared a new variable called a, but like I said, what we can't do is start creating variables called var, for example. That is a reserved keyword. So let's go ahead and undo those changes. Now, before we continue, it's good to know that variables, unless they're in different scopes, which is something that we'll come onto later in this course to talk about scoping, all variables must have a fully unique name because otherwise they're going to interfere and override each other. Now, this is a common thing in many programming languages as well, so if you're coming from other languages, this will be nice and familiar to you. Now, in JavaScript, we indeed have three ways to declare a variable. We have one, the var keyword, which we're going to learn about in this video, and we're also going to explore how things such as hoisting works with variables. And the two other ways are let and const, which is a constant. But like I said, they'll be coming in the next few videos. So let's talk about what we've actually done so far with our var a. What we've done here is create something that we call a unique identifier. Now, a is the identifier that we can go ahead and reference elsewhere. So for example, we could say, I want to console log a. Now, this a that we have created above is actually called a declaration. Now, I haven't hit save yet because it's quite interesting, the behavior of a default variable declaration. Now, what do you think is going to be the value when we hit save and log this out? Now, if you're new to JavaScript, you may not have the answer, but if you're experienced or perhaps you've used JavaScript before, you may have guessed that the value will become undefined, as we have over here in the console. So it's interesting that there's technically two parts to a variable, and the first part of that is the declaration of the variable. So here we're actually saying I'm creating this new identifier called a, and we're simply just declaring it. The next step is initialization. Now, when we initialize a variable, we then go ahead and give it a value. So here I'm going to say that a is then going to be equal to the number 99. So when we go ahead and hit save, we see 99 in the console. Now, the interesting piece is, if you're new to JavaScript, this may surprise you. If we create two console logs, we're going to have undefined and then the number 99. Now, this is because we have created this variable here with no value. We've simply declared it. So at this point in time, when our code is executed, this console log, we then see undefined. And then here we are initializing the variable with the number 99. So when we reach our next line of code, that then has the value that we want. Something else about variables is we can actually declare multiple variables on a single line. So what we could say down here is we want to create b is going to be the number 11, and we'll have c equals 55. If we then went and logged these out in the console, you can see the same thing will happen and we get our nice numbers. Now, we won't go ahead and log out these as well because they are simply undefined, but this demonstrates that you can comma separate from the variable keyword. However, I don't really like this pattern. It's not very clear and people often put them on new lines like this and it can get confusing. So my typical rule is if you're creating multiple variable declarations, I would recommend doing it something like this, where we have very easy to read. We can skim down the left-hand side and we can see var, 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 and then ABC. Now, So far we've looked at declaration and initialization of variables, but we can actually essentially kill two birds with one stone and do them both at the same time. So here we can say var a equals 99, and we can change b over to 11, and finally c over to 55. So when we edit our console log here, you can hit save and we'll see 99, 11, and 55. Now what's actually interesting is this first console log does in fact correspond to these values, whereas this second console log, we're still technically overriding these variables. So if I went and changed a to 66, we would see that change reflect here in the console. So this is what it's meant by JavaScript being a dynamically typed language, is we can assign dynamic types to it at any point in the program's execution. Now this isn't technically a dynamic type because it's still a number. However, we could change 66 over to be an object, we could change our second variable to be an array, and finally we could change this over to be a string with the number 55 inside. Now if you look at this, we then have our ABC above with the respective values being logged out, and then we've essentially overwritten them here. So JavaScript variables give you that opportunity to override them, reassign new values, and we'll look at let and const in the next couple of videos to understand some of the differences between these approaches when declaring different types of variables. Now the next thing that I want to discuss is something called variable hoisting, which is an interesting topic and it kind of plays into what we've done so far. So with our existing knowledge in mind, we're going to create a new variable called a, and we'll simply assign it the value of 99. Now this is really great, and we've learned so far that a variable declaration, such as giving it a name, an identifier of a, gives us a default value of undefined. Now, what happens if I try and reference a variable that technically doesn't exist yet? And we know that it doesn't exist because JavaScript executes in order. So if I tried to console log a down here, we would in fact get a different result as if I console logged it up here. So you can see here that we have the first console log gives us undefined, and the second one gives us the number 99. Now this is interesting because of the way that the declarations and the value of the variables actually work. So here, the interesting thing to remember, and this is quite crucial, a thing to remember, is the variable itself is hoisted, and hoisting is essentially bringing the variable name to the top of the script declaration. So what the JavaScript engine is technically doing is this for us, and then further down it's reassigning it. So when we understand it this way, we have the value of undefined to begin with, and then we are initializing that variable with a value of 99. So once we save, we'll check over here, nothing has actually changed. And this typical behavior where we have this variable which is magically put to the top is called hoisting in JavaScript. So that is a quicker introduction and a worthy introduction to JavaScript variables, how they work, what hoisting is, what is in fact a declaration and an initialization. And as we continue through this course, we'll be using many variables to hold different types of data. We'll be logging them, we'll be mutating data, and so forth. So with that out the way, we're going to have a look at something called let, the let statement in JavaScript in the next video.